So will God forgive you no matter what you've done? Well, let's talk about on this week's episode of Journey at Home. Well, hey, thanks so much for tuning in. Great to have you with us. And all of us, whether we're Christian or not a Christian, I think we can all agree we have made a mess of things at different points in our lives, haven't we? We Christians, we got a term for that. We call it sin. Now, if you're not a Christian, you may think of those moments more as mistakes, but you also probably realize it's more than that, isn't it? A mistake's when you miscalculate some numbers. It's just an accident. But some of the choices that we've made in our lives, well, they were not accidents, were they? We knew what we were doing, and we did it anyway. And the proof of that is this emotion that we're all familiar with. It's the emotion of guilt. So you don't feel guilt when you miscalculate a quadratic equation. You feel guilt when you intentionally make a choice you know is wrong. Guilt is a result of not measuring up to a standard. Well, what standard? We could start with our own, can't we? I mean, you've got a personal standard that you believe you ought to live up to. And when you fail to meet that standard, you feel guilty about it, don't you? For example, you said you would never be the kind of person who did, fill in the blank, but then you did that anyway. Or you promised you'd always do, fill in the blank, but then you didn't follow through and do it. Whenever you fail to meet your standard, it creates guilt. But here's the thing. Your standard is not the only standard by which you're measured. And that's actually some really good news, because if everybody had the freedom to create their own standard, well, there'd be no standard, right? The world never turns out well when everybody's making their own rules. But God, He has a bigger, universal standard that applies to every human being who's ever lived, and we have all blown that standard too. Now, the problem is when you realize that you've blown God's standard, guess what it creates? Yeah, more guilt. That's why some of you dropped out of church, isn't it? You didn't want to be reminded of your guilt every week. It's why some of you have yet to choose to embrace a relationship with God, because from your point of view, or maybe the way it was explained to you, it just feels like the goal of faith is to create guilt in people, and you're thinking, I don't need any more of that, right? No point in coming to church just to hear how bad I am. I already feel guilty enough. But that is not the point of Christianity, and it is not why Jesus came. So we're in episode 2 of our series, 3 questions that everybody has about God. Now, you may believe the church isn't a place where you can ask questions, but listen, questions are really important. If you're too intimidated to ask questions, if you're too intimidated to express doubts about faith, well, you've got a pretty fragile faith. Jesus invited people's questions. I love this about Him. He was never offended by questions. So what we're doing is we're exploring some of the questions that we've all wondered at times, but maybe we've just been too afraid to ask them. And today, the question I want us to discuss is this: will God forgive me? Will God forgive me? I think the truth is we have all wondered that at times, and it's a really important question because the only antidote to guilt is forgiveness. But most of us, we got a really hard time believing God's going to forgive us because most of us have a hard time forgiving ourselves. So today, what I want to do is I want to explain in as clear and simple terms as I can what God has done to free you and what God has done to free me of guilt, and what He's done to help us experience forgiveness. To do that, I want to show you part of a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to Christians in the city of Rome, where he explains the forgiveness that God offers to each of us. Now listen, you may think you've done some things that God's never going to forgive you for, but I can promise you don't have anything on Paul. Paul had murdered Jesus' followers. Paul had taken fathers from their sons and their daughters. Paul had wrecked families. Paul had been a terrorist against the early followers of Jesus. That's why at one point Paul called himself the chief of sinners. He knew he had missed the standard by a mile, and he knew what it felt like to live with guilt from his past. But here's the good news. When Paul met Jesus, he was not met with more guilt. He was surprised instead by grace. And Paul spent the rest of his life trying to help other people know the same grace that changed him forever. So what I want to do is I want to share with you how Paul describes it to these Roman Christians. And I probably need to warn you, he uses some theological terms that make this sound a little bit complicated to understand, but I'm going to do my best to explain it in a way that's easy for you to get, okay? So in Romans chapter 3, in verse 20, He starts by talking about this awareness we all have, and then he ends with forgiveness. Here's what he wrote. He says, therefore, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by observing the law. Rather, he says, through the law, we actually become conscious of sin. Now, the law that Paul's referring to was the Jewish law, the law that God had originally given to Moses and the people of Israel. And we read about it in our Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures. And Paul's point is, hey, we Jewish people, we've been trying to live up to this standard for thousands of years, and all it's done is convince us we're not good enough to meet it. All it's done is make us aware of how often we mess up. Now, being aware is actually important, because if you're doing something that's going to hurt you, but you don't know it's going to hurt you, well, that's pretty dangerous. So feeling guilty when you sin, well, it can be a really positive thing. It's like a warning light on your dashboard that's going, whoa, whoa, wait a minute, pay attention. There's something not right between me and God. There's a better way to live. I'm in danger, I'm doing something that's going to hurt me and I don't even realize it. That's what guilt is there to do. But what do you do once you're aware that you missed the standard? What do you do when you know what's right? You still don't do it. Can you find forgiveness then? Well, Paul has some great news. He goes on to write, but now a righteousness. And the word righteousness means a right standing with God. Now, think of it this way. You know what it means to have a right standing with somebody. It just means there's no conflict, no awkwardness in your relationship with them. There are probably some people that you don't have a right standing with. And you know that because when you see them, when you talk to them, it's just tense, isn't it? Feels weird. You run into them at the ball game, you want to duck or look away. You get a text from them, you get this feeling in the pit of your stomach like, oh no, here we go again. But when you have a right standing with somebody, none of that junk's there. Everything's good. And Paul's going, okay, you've got some junk between you and God. It's called sin. That's why you don't feel comfortable with God. It's why you're never sure how he feels about you. But then Paul says there's a way for you to clear all that up. There's a way for you to have a right standing. And the next two words Paul writes tells us how. He wrote, but now a righteousness from God. Don't miss that. A right standing with God comes from God. It doesn't come from you. It doesn't come from you cleaning up your act. It doesn't come from you making up for what you messed up. It doesn't come from you living a good life and earning God's approval. No, Paul says your right standing with God comes from God, apart from a law, meaning there's no way you can earn it. There's no way you can be good enough or obey well enough to get it. It's apart from law, and it's been made known, he writes, to which the law and the prophets testify. That just means that Jesus chose to work his way to us instead of asking us to work our way to him. It means Jesus didn't walk away from our mess. He walked right into it, and he met us right where we were. And then Paul writes, this righteousness, and here are two words again, this righteousness from God comes through faith in Jesus Christ to all, to any who believe. Now, whenever you see the word faith or you see the word believe in the New Testament, I just want you to think trust, okay? Because anyone who chooses to trust that Jesus paid the penalty for their sins when he died on the cross, well, anybody who trusts gets a right standing with God. God took our relationship that was all messed up. Jesus took all of that sin that we had committed and he put it on himself. And then he said, I'm going to give you my relationship with God, which was perfect. That's what he made possible for us. I'll take your messed up relationship, I'll give you my perfect one. And Paul says anybody can have that kind of right standing with God. Even, according to Paul, a guy like him who had murdered followers of Jesus. Now, maybe for some of you that's really hard to believe because of the guilt that you carry over what you've done. So you hear this, you listen to somebody like me talk about it, and you think, yeah, Matt, but if you knew what was going on inside of me, if you knew what was in my past, I just don't think God's going to forgive me. But listen, Paul knew from experience that you have no reason to worry about that, which is why he went on and he wrote, there is no difference. There's no difference between those of us who think we're good and those of us who know we're not. There is no difference, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory or the standard of God. In other words, you're no exception. We're all in the same boat. There's no one who hasn't fallen short of God's standard. But Paul's not finished there. This is what I love about this statement. He doesn't end it with a period. He actually puts a comma there, because in spite of the fact that we have made such a mess of things, in spite of the fact that we've rebelled against our Creator, that The good news is we can still be good with God. So he goes, okay, all have sinned, all fall short of God's standard, and Paul says, all are justified or freely forgiven by his grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. So here was Paul's point. He's going, in case you didn't get it the first time, this right standing with God comes from God through our faith or our trust in Jesus and what he did for us. What needed to be done has been done on your behalf by Jesus. When you had a debt you couldn't pay, good news, Jesus stepped in, he paid it for you. He did for you what you couldn't do for yourself, and now he offers you forgiveness freely. That is what the death and resurrection of Jesus was all about. So, let's circle all the way back to our question, okay? The question of, well, will God forgive me? The short answer is, you better believe it. It doesn't matter what you've done. It doesn't matter how bad you've been. Jesus' death covers all your sin. So when you trust what he's done for you, you don't have to live with guilt anymore. He frees you of that. If God's forgiven you, listen, if God's forgiven you, you can forgive yourself. If God's paid the price for your sin, you don't have to keep trying to make up to God what you messed up. And you don't have to keep running from God because he's not trying to pay you back. He is trying to win you back. He is offering you the thing that we all crave the most, forgiveness. A right standing with God, it comes from God through faith in Jesus. So you don't have to wonder another moment. Was everything good between me and God? You don't have to wonder if you're alienated from him. You don't have to wonder if he loves you and accepts you. Now you can have confidence because of what Jesus did for you. And when you experience that kind of extraordinary forgiveness, it changes everything. Then you're willing, then you're able to offer forgiveness to other people because of how much you've been forgiven. Then you can live with confidence that God's with you, that he's for you, that he loves you. You don't have to deal with guilt and shame anymore. And the best part is this gift of forgiveness is available to you. That's how much God cares about you personally. So, if today this has made sense, for whatever reason it's clicked for you, and for the first time you understand, oh man, I am a sinner, and there's no way I can make up for that. There's no way I can earn God's forgiveness. But you've also realized the good news. You don't have to try to earn it. Jesus is already offering it to you for free. If that's you today, I want to encourage you to take a really big step. I want to encourage you to put your trust in Jesus. Paul said this righteousness comes from God through faith in Jesus to all who believe. So would you trust, would you believe that Jesus has already done everything that needs to be done for you to be forgiven? If you're ready to do that, just tell him right where you are. Just say, Jesus, I'm trusting you. I'm going to believe. And I'm going to accept what you did for me on the cross. And I give you my life. I'm ready to follow. If that's a decision you're making, I would love to know about it. Shoot us an email, contact us, let us know. We'd love to celebrate with you. We'd love to answer any questions you have. And we'd love to help you take your next step in following Jesus. And we'll pick it up right there next week for episode 3 of 3 questions everybody has about God.